I think we're about to get started here. Hopefully this is working right and you can hear me. My name is Andy Bast. I am the Director of Development here at Western Seminary and just want to welcome you to this webinar. If you have any, just a few notes before we kind of get started. If you have any connectivity issues, there's a chat box that should be right below there that you can feel free to use, and we'll do our best to try to help you out with that. Chuck and John are also gonna have some time for Q&A, for some questions. So you can feel free, there's a Q&A box that we'll use for that, also right below here. And so we would love for you to participate by asking questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We're also going to be recording this, and we'll follow it up with a link to you in an email that we'll send later today or tomorrow. And so you can look for that in an email. And then finally, we weren't planning on doing another webinar soon on the heels of this, but in light of this last week, we are going to have another webinar, which we're calling Race and the Church, a Christian Response to the Death of George Floyd. And that is going to be next Wednesday June 10, from 2 to 3:30 Eastern Standard. It will feature a panel discussion with Reverend Cora Tate, who is a member of our Board of Trustees and also serves as a pastor in the Bronx. Keith Reynolds, who until fairly recently was a pastor at Engedi Church here in Holland, and now serves as an associate director of admissions here at Western. Suzanne McDonald, professor of systematic and historical theology. Travis West, associate professor of Hebrew and Old Testament, and Felix Theonagraha, our president. So we do hope you'll join us for that, and we'll send you information on how to register for that webinar next Wednesday. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chuck and John. Thank you so much, Chuck and John, for hosting this conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andy.
Hello, my friend.
Hey, man. It's just the two of us now, right?
It's just us, man.
That's good.
How are you?
I'm good. It's a beautiful day in Holland.
It's very nice. Do you want to introduce yourself, just to let anyone who's tuning in know who you are and where you've been?
Yeah. So Chuck DeGroat, married to Sarah for 25 years, 2 daughters, 1 in college, 1 in high school. For the last 25 years or so, pastoral ministry for a long time. I've been a clinical therapist, a writer, a retreat leader, and now I get to teach pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary.
That's awesome. You're really good at all of it too. I'm Jon Brown. I am currently one of the pastors at Pillar Church in Holland, Michigan, just down the road from the seminary. I've been here for about 8 years. Prior to that, lived in the Pacific Northwest on Whidbey Island, a part of the First Reformed Church community there, where I served for a while. Married to Kristen, have 4 daughters, Lydia, Tabitha, Mariah, and Ava. Just yesterday, I rode my bike here to church. There was a friend and parishioner sitting in his car. He yelled my name, so I went over to the car, and he said, "Hey, we just had a prayer meeting on your front lawn. We prayed for you." And I had that kind of simultaneous feeling of gratitude and also curiosity, like, well, what do you think's wrong with me? Kind of a thing. And then he added, "We all agreed you look really tired."
Okay.
Yeah, and my first thought was, okay, thank you. And my second thought was, yeah, it's probably true. And I'm only adding that to this conversation to invite us all into a little bit of honesty for the next little while as we think about wholeheartedness. Chuck, in the book that you wrote, you wholeheartedness, busyness, exhaustion, and healing the divided self, you include a quote that says, "The antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness."
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
reflect on that for us a little bit?
First, I got to say, I'm sitting here thinking this is the first time I haven't had to talk about narcissism in about 3 months. And so, I'm so happy. So don't ask any questions about narcissism.
Okay.
That is a quote that that is really important to me personally. It was in the early 2000s. I was exhausted. In fact, I was so exhausted that I took the family on vacation. We went out to a beach, Daytona Beach. I brought like 10 books, as we do when we're pastors.
Right.
Girls were in diapers. The pool, it was I was in Orlando at the time. The pool in Daytona Beach on a 90-degree, 95% humidity day was closed because a kid had pooped in it.
Oh, man.
And I was angry. We didn't get the room that we wanted. And I remember coming back to Orlando that Monday, a friend, an older friend, kind of a mentor in my life, saw my exhaustion, much the way you just described it, saw how tired I was. And I'm like 32 at the time. I shouldn't be this exhausted. And she gave me a CD. Do you remember CDs, John? This like,
little hole in the middle.
Hole in the middle.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
And it was called The Poetry of Self-Compassion by a poet named David White, a Welsh poet who doesn't just read poems. He talks about life, and he tells the story of sitting with a mentor of his, Brother David Steindale Rast, one evening at a particularly exhausting moment in his life. They'd gather, they'd drink wine, and they would read Rainer Maria Rilke together. And on this night, David White simply said, "Tell me about exhaustion."
Mm.
And Brother David Steindale Rast says to him, "The antidote to exhaustion is not necessarily rest," and pause. And I love that, because then you're sort of, I think I've been at the edge of my seat for the last like 20 years waiting for the answer to that still, but he says the antidote to exhaustion is wholeheartedness. And I chewed on that personally, practically, therapeutically, theologically, psychologically for about the next 15 years before I ended up writing a book on it.
Mm. So when I think of exhaustion, as you just said, the antidote is not rest. So in my sort of daily living, maybe I'm exhausted, I just can't wait for the weekend.
Yeah.
Or I'm exhausted, I just can't wait for vacation. Or I'm exhausted, I just need a little time in the morning. Or I'm exhausted, maybe I should drink a glass of water with my glass of wine. Or I'm exhausted, I should exercise a little bit more. And all of those are probably valuable things. But that's not really what you're after with wholeheartedness. No.
I think so often when we talk about rest, we think, oh, thank God it's Friday, the weekend's here. And now I, Jon Brown, can, at 12 o'clock on a Saturday, watch a Michigan game, work myself into a frenzy, as throws another missed pass, incomplete pass.
I think this conversation is over now. Thank you so much, Chuck.
That's what we call rest often, is a different version of exhausting ourselves to death, right? So it's no problem with the word rest. It's just how we understand it. I think wholeheartedness gets at something far more fundamental. I think it gets at the shalom that we speak of as Christians, Judeo-Christians, right? Mm-hmm. There's something far more fundamental. It gets at a kind of a way of being, a way of flourishing, a divine design for our lives.
Mm. And what are some of the things in your experience, your reflection, that, well, in the book you talk about a divided life leading to the exhaustion. What does that even mean? How does that?
Yeah, let me unpack something that I don't do in the book, but it's kind of funny because I tend to think a bit more fluidly or abstractly. People want me to think a little bit more linearly. And so a friend came to me after the book was written and said, "What's your definition of wholeheartedness?" And I said, I don't know. Read the book and we'll figure it out somehow. But I sort of consolidated it. Wholeheartedness is an experience of oneness and worthiness in Christ. let me just step back for a second. I think first and foremost, it's a conversation that we have, that we're already having about exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a conversation that we need to have about our divided lives. I think of, I'll say it, just wrote this book on narcissism. And I've worked with many, many leaders in the corporate world, pastoral leaders, institutional leaders who live divided lives. And so you get the pretty put together part of them, the polite, the nice, the achieving part, and in the shadows is the addict, is the depression, the disappointment, the bad marriage, you know what I'm talking about. So divided life. But I think it also gets at, this is relevant, it's going to be relevant for our conversation next week on George Floyd, when we do this again, when others do this next week. But it gets at how we in our divisions end up judging, scapegoating, othering. Mm-hmm. And so in the midst of our own self-protection, and there are all kinds of psychological self-protective devices, right, we end up finding someone else to blame, putting the pain over there instead of doing the transformational work in our own lives. And so it's an experience of oneness and worthiness in Christ. Yeah. Let me just break that down real quick. It's an experience. I love theology. I love your sermons, John. I love when we make it clear that we are daughters and sons of Jesus, that our identity is in Christ. But the prodigal son knew that he was a son and didn't live as a son, and had to go to hell and back to discover his sonship. And so there's something about an experience, experiential knowing, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, failure along the way, walls coming down, my false self being exposed, all these kinds of things that are at work in this. It's an experience of oneness and worthiness. I will sometimes do 2 or 3 days in a retreat on oneness and worthiness, but really quickly, I talk to my students often about ego deflation and ego inflation and how we live between the 2 extremes, particularly in ministry. And so I'm doing good, I'm achieving, I'm accomplishing. It was a great sermon on Sunday. That was a home run. Ego inflation. And then for the rest of our lives, we're just kind of trying to survive and keep that game going, because inevitably there's the swing and the miss. There's the painful moment of hurting someone with our words. There's the inappropriate response to racism in our community, ego deflation. Now I'm lost. Who am I? What am I? There's nothing left of me. I don't think there's anything ever there in the first place. Right. Just this past year, 5 suicides of pastors, men in particular in ministry, who are wildly successful, but on the flip side, ego deflation, depression, melancholy, sadness, disappointment, shame, addiction. And so we live our lives in this kind of attain, accomplish, do, work. And what we miss out on is the fundamental reality that we're the beloved. That we're already one, that we're already worthy, that as the Father says to the older brother, you're always with me and everything I have is yours. As Augustine says, lo, I was within, but you were on the outside. I was with you, God says. Like I wasn't out there to be attained. I was already with you, but you were looking for me here and there and everywhere. And that's what we end up doing. Even those of us who know this stuff inside and out and preach it week in and week out, this is what we end up doing. So an experience of oneness and worthiness in Christ. I could end the definition as an experience of oneness and worthiness, and then we could add on in addiction or in food or in accomplishment or in my work or in my title. And none of that would hold up. None of that is sturdy enough. None of that is grounding enough. And this is, I think, why Paul, 160 times, you know this better than I do, 160 times plus uses some form of in Christ, in the Spirit, in the Lord, as if to say, this is who you are. This is what fundamentally grounds you. And so wholeheartedness is really a conversation that draws us back to the ground of our being, which is like, that's impermeable. That's always there. It's we who are looking for it elsewhere.
Right. So good. There's a lot. That's a lot. So there's just some things that kind of stir in my spirit. So if I'm hearing you, wholeheartedness is not an ascent to accomplishment. Like I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do more. Maybe I'll read my Bible, say my prayers, have a little more quiet time, make sure I take Sabbath, and I'm going to guard it diligently. And I'm not picking on any of those practices, but so much of them are this sort of idea of ascending towards progress. If I'm hearing you, you're saying, no, actually descend towards weakness.
Yeah. I mean, who may ascend the hill of the Lord? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, right? Up, up, up we go, trying to find God when the reality is that game didn't work.
Yeah.
And God and Jesus came to meet us right where we are. And I think that's part of the paradox here is we didn't recognize that Jesus, we didn't recognize God in the flesh, God meeting us in our addiction. I get to, in my therapeutic practice, work with people who hit the lowest of the lows, like stories I can't describe because they would be too dirty, disgusting, inappropriate, frankly, to say over the airwaves or whatever this is, right? And so, but God meeting them at the very base, at the very bottom, when we think it's a game of accomplishment, God meets us right where we are and comes even more near in the spirit, right? Like God from the beginning, since the fall, right? And since we exiled ourselves, God is like, I'm going to come closer and closer. I'm going to keep coming. You're going to keep pushing me away and you'll end up in exile, but I'll restore you. I'll redeem you. I'll keep coming and coming and coming and coming.
Yeah. It's the garden question.
Yeah.
Where are you?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a concern, a caution, a worry that this actually becomes just sort of like navel gazing?
Yeah.
Shouldn't I turn my eyes upwards, forget about myself, deny myself? And you're kind of inviting me, no, actually take a deeper look, Jon. You want to pursue wholeheartedness. You're exhausted, you're tired, you're divided. Go deeper in.
Yeah.
Isn't that a little like self-absorbed?
Yeah, this is actually the question that comes up a lot in the narcissism conversation, because isn't that self-absorption when someone becomes narcissistic? And actually that's someone who pays very little attention to their own heart, to their own inner life. Guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life, right? And yet, instead of guarding our hearts, we live from self-protective walls that keep us invulnerable. We live from a false self. And so there's really little conversation with God, with the God who dwells and lives in our own hearts.
Right.
I think actually any redemptive conversation with God, any kind of inner work that I'm talking about, and this is in the tradition. This is in St. Augustine. This is on John Calvin. It was Augustine who first said, "Let me know myself, O God, let me know you," in chapter 10 of the Confessions. And so any redemptive conversation about knowing oneself necessarily leads to humility and curiosity. If it leads to narcissism, it's not a true knowing of oneself. And so I get it, because it feels like, well, if you're doing all that inner work and navel gazing, you're actually not gonna be able to speak to the needs of your community, to racial injustice. And what I would say to that is, again, even in our Christian tradition, but I think in more recent writers, more recent figures like Martin Luther King Jr., right? Behind MLK was Howard Thurman, a Black contemplative who actually invited MLK into this sort of inner life that allows him to move out. And all good activists are first contemplative, self-aware. They understand how they're triggered. They understand how they're traumatized, so that they can move out in healthy and humble ways.
Yeah. So it's the deep dive into self-awareness so as to come up again for the world.
That's exactly it. For the sake of the world. This is not about me. This is not about you. This is ultimately, I often say that this work is ultimately missional. It's ultimately for the kingdom, for our neighbor. Yeah.
So good. So I've got a bunch more questions, but anyone who's listening in, I also want to invite you to clack away on the Q&A thing on the bottom of your screen. We'll happily do our best to respond to those. So part of exhaustion, this divided life, words like anxiety and worry come to my mind. Before this whole pandemic thing, some were suggesting that we live in the age of anxiety.
Yeah.
So a couple questions. One, what is anxiety, worry? How does it show up in our lives? Like, what does it look like? And then how have you seen it showing up in this like super anxious season?
Yeah. It's always tricky for me when we sort of self-referentially in our own day and time say we live in the greatest age of anxiety, or the greatest age of narcissism, or the greatest age of whatever, fill in the blank, right? When this has been present since Genesis 3, since the fall, in one way or another, right? But I do think that there is a different kind of anxiety or energy alive and at work, a kind of invisible, anxious energy that now globally interconnects us, right? Thoreau said it maybe 100 years ago, the massive men lead lives of quiet desperation, right? And I think that there is a sense in which that desperation shows up in new and deeper and more troubling ways in every generation. I think the thing about where we are right now in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of one of the great crises, one of the great racial injustices, one of the great moments of revolution, in fact, an awakening to the reality of systemic racism. The reality is that when you take that's a pretty potent cocktail, right? You just have where we were before all this happened,
right.
And you layer upon that a global pandemic.
Right.
The last time that happened was like, what, 1916 or something like that, and you layer upon that 3 in 2020, at least 3 that we know of, just sickening, maddening, ludicrous stories of police brutality, right? And so, this is where we are. This is where people like me talk often about trauma. Trauma is what happens in our body as a response to the external forces, right? And so there's a lot of chaos going on around me, and my body has to deal with that one way or another. And often we go into hyperarousal or hypoarousal. We go into a sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous reaction kind of response, and that's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I won't get into these, but these are the classic fight or flight, right? And so I need someone to blame, and I'm going to take someone on. I'm going to jump on Facebook, and I'm going to blame my grandpa and my mom and my cousin and my pastor John, and well, I'm just gonna run from this. I can't, so I flee, right? I can't deal with it. I'm gonna close my laptop. I can't, or maybe I'm gonna freeze. Everything sort of shuts down, and I lay in bed and I start to get sad, or I start to get depressed, or maybe I'm gonna fawn, which is the 4th response, and that's it. Okay, what do I need to do? I'm a white person who really probably needs to participate right now, so I need to find my way, and I need to probably write something on Facebook, but I'm not sure how. Each one of these responses is a way that are, and you got to think, like, internally, it's like we're on a hamster wheel. Our brains, our bodies are going a mile a minute. Yeah. And I would argue that unless we slow down and pay attention, we go sort of meta, we pay attention, we get on the balcony, we understand what's going on in our own hearts, we're going to respond in one way or another that brings more pain into the world, into the situation.
Right. So if we don't tend to ourselves and our own divided lives, it's going to come out sideways as we try to enter into public conversation.
And that's, by the way, in no way to say that it's not going to be messy anytime we step in, and that's in no way to say be silent, right? Because I think that's the Flea response, silence, right? It is to say that what would it look like for you and for me to engage in an active conversation around what's alive in us, what we're feeling, what we need, what we're doing with those needs. And then out of that, maybe check with some friends. John, this is what's going on in my life right now. This is what I'm feeling. I want to do this, but I'm hesitant. What do you think? That's the work that we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in wholeheartedness, how about this? It's very nice. You offer, so I've experienced you. We hang out plenty, and I'm always seeking your wisdom and advice, and I'm asking you for like, but what should I do? Like, give me like 4 things to do. And in our relationship, you're always kind of hesitant to like give this 3 an opportunity to achieve success. In the book, you're pretty hesitant to do the same, though you do offer some pathways, I think you call them.
Yes.
Like, beginning of the day, take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Can you kind of...
Yeah. So you'll notice that already in our time together, I've talked about some things that you can do, that look like the kind of inner archaeological work, the kind of digging away of things that might be getting in the way, that might be clouding real clarity. Late in the book somewhere, I talk about 3 particular pathways, the pathways of awareness, relationship, and story.
Yeah.
Awareness gets at that, so what do I need to know about what's going on inside of me? So many of us are so unaware of what's going on inside, and so it just comes out sideways. Say something out loud. People come to me for marriage counseling because this has gone on repeatedly over the course of years, and they no longer know how to speak. And so as we become self-aware, this is the ancient idea of self-knowledge, we're better able to pay attention to those dynamics. Relationship, that's you and me. I go to John and I say, John, I am really struggling today. I'm struggling right now this week during this season of COVID. You say, tell me a little bit more about that. Where's your heart been? I share a little bit with you. You start to connect some dots. Well, what do you think about this? Or what about that? Or are you drinking a little bit too much, Chuck? Or how's your relationship with Sarah? Or that's relationship. That story is the deeper work that we do oftentimes with a therapist, of connecting the dots of our lives, beginning to ask, like, so why is it that I relate in that way? Like, why is my default pattern always fight? Why is my default pattern always fawn? We live, by the way, if you're listening, John and I both live in Holland, Michigan. We were on the West Coast before this in different places, but I think we both would note that when I moved from San Francisco to here, you from the Seattle area to here, this is very much a kind of flight or fawn world in terms of trauma response. Fawn, just be nice, be polite, do the right thing.
Community in America.
Yeah, right. Then we don't know what to do, and people start sort of flushing the streets with activity and signs. Black Lives Matter. Fight? Well, I'm not sure about that. In your anger, do not sin. And so, we wonder what to do with these kinds of things. And so story allows us to connect the dots. Oh, in my family, we were never allowed to speak. Girls are seen and not heard. So I, a woman, never found my voice. In our family, conflict wasn't allowed. Or in my family, it was all conflict. We never got through it. All we did was fight with one another. And so awareness, relationship, story are 3 pathways.
And the story piece in the book, you talk about liturgy, worship.
Yeah.
Which was interesting to me, because so often liturgy can be conceived of as something that's not true to who I am. It's a sort of imposed thing on me. You're not really talking about an order of things that happen in a Sunday. You're talking about participating in a much larger reality.
I'm talking about yearly, weekly, daily liturgy. I'm talking about like how liturgy restores us. I mean, if I'm just left to the devices of myself and my own story, what is there, Right. But when I get to church on Sunday morning and John says, the Lord be with you, and also with you. By the way, that's echoed in other cultures with a phrase, namaste. I greet the God within you. There are these greetings that we give one another, shalom, that speak to the sacredness of life. The Lord be with you. There's a recognition at the very beginning, at least part of the story. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think I know what you're trying to do with that. You're trying to say, God is here. God is here with you. God is here with me. The Lord is with you. The Lord is with me.
Yeah.
Augustine says God is more near to me than I am to myself. And so, and then the story goes on. We confess. Why? Because we've lost track of the story. We've lost track of ourselves. And so confession is a way of saying, I've sought you here and here and here and here, and I've got my needs here. Oh, and so now I come back. And guess what? When I come back, part of the story is God looks up upon me and says, oh, I love you. I forgive you. Thank you. I'm glad we're back again.
Yeah.
I mean, I call it liturgical therapy.
It's good. Hey, there's a couple of questions from some of our friends. Anastasia, my good friend,
Yes.
graduate of Western a few years ago, now down in Indiana. I'm just going to read her question if you don't mind responding to it. A lot of the work of pursuing wholeheartedness requires inviting others in. That can be hard in a global pandemic. It's really easy to hide when our primary engagement with others is through a screen. What does it look like to invite our people in when face-to-face time is hard right now?
Oh, this has been it. Like Anastasia just sort of asked the question that I think we've all been wrestling with at some level in this epidemic of loneliness and isolation, right? You and I think early on, John, with our wives connected over a happy hour, and it wasn't the same. I mean, there was a screen, and there wasn't a hug. There wasn't breathing the same air.
Right.
I think first we've got to recognize what this is doing to us. And I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this awareness piece is really important. How we cope in the midst of our loneliness is really significant. And I've seen a discernible, recognizable pattern. It's a larger conversation, but as this whole thing has unfolded, I can't tell you how many people told me they were over drinking, overeating, falling back into old addictions, all as a kind of like, what do I do with my soul in this? I'm longing for something. I need to connect in some way or another. People threw themselves into work. People drew themselves away from work. I think out of that, when we recognize our need, that's when we can connect. It's really hard to connect when we're not recognizing our need, because then we're only trauma bonding. Man, I hate COVID. Don't you hate COVID? This sucks. I can't believe Gretchen Whitmer is doing this in Michigan. Gavin Newsom and not Mario Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo. That was his dad. That was my governor when I grew up in New York. And then we're just complaining instead of, and I do plenty of this, you know that. But if you've got a good friend in your life, you'll sort of say, so what's the need behind that, Chuck? What are you longing for? What are you crying out for? What are you hungry for? And that's what connects us. That's what we need right now, however we can get it.
Yeah, I agree. This is from our friend Andy Cadsman out east, Wyckoff, New Jersey. Again, I'll just read it. I was recently part of a conversation among pastors where someone suggested that in order to help all these pastors who are feeling burned out amidst pandemic, churches should give their pastors an extra week of vacation this year and require it to be taken in the next 30 days. Many pastors responded saying, that's a great sentiment, but if I can't get away, then that week won't be restful, rejuvenating what I need right now. I thought of Chuck's story of Daytona Beach vacation and have been wondering about how to engage work and rest differently so that I don't need vacation or time off to regroup from exhaustion and re-engage work. Where do we start in a pandemic?
Yeah, you see, I think the conversation about wholeheartedness gets at how we hold all of these spaces: work, play, rest, vacation. Wholeheartedness undergirds all of it. So that's not like, we're not dichotomizing, like, I'm working really hard right now, but then I'm going to rest really hard,
Work hard, play hard.
Yeah. It's a daily cultivation it's a daily practice of the presence of God. So it's a recognition from the very first moment I wake up and you wake up, things start churning.
Yeah.
So unless from the very beginning, we don't open our phones and jump on CNN or ESPN, or unless from the very beginning, we cultivate that space for intimacy, for union and communion. That's that oneness and worthiness piece. If we don't cultivate that, we will find ourselves off to the races, suddenly trying to find, well, how many likes did my post get? How many people viewed the service last week? What's the other church doing this week with their work? Whatever it might be. that said, I do think practical, just to kind of get to Andy's question, I think practical ways of addressing this can be really helpful. My friend Danae Pierre is a really extraordinary woman and leader in Phoenix and in the Redeemer Church Planting Network. Yes, a woman, a leader in the Redeemer Church Planting Network. Hispanic woman, her husband, a Black church planter in Phoenix, very invested in activism in Phoenix. Danae, to the network pastors, and I hope I got this right, but I'll approximate it. Essentially, at the beginning of COVID, said, I want you to essentially work half-time, because I know that you're going to be working like crazy. I know the boundaries are gone. I know you're going to be working morning, evening, and night. So I want you to, so if you put in 50 hours a week or something, put in 25 hours, and then be really intentional about resting. So she actually took off the table from the very beginning. She created mental space. She wasn't giving this as a rule or requirement. She just created mental space to say, I know you're going to be really busy. And so recognize that, work those 25 to 30 hours really hard, give it your all, and then rest well. I think there are practical things like that we can do too.
Yeah, that's good. Brandon Smith and his wife Stephanie, clergy couple down south a little ways from here, is asking if he had not heard of the Fawn Strategy for dealing with anxiety. Can you describe that just a little bit more?
Yeah, let me recommend a book, by the way, too, as we're talking about this, a newer book by a woman named Andi Kolber, a therapist, Christian therapist out of Denver Seminary, practices in Denver, called Try Softer. She describes it pretty eloquently. And he wants a little bit more elaboration on that, right? Is that right?
Yeah, just describe a little bit more of what is Fawn.
Yeah, so Fawn is a strategy of cooperation, of politeness. Fawn is you grew up in a home where you never knew when mom's anger was going to fly off the handle and dad was always gone, but you knew that if you're a good boy or a good girl, things would be relatively stable. You cross the boundary and things would become unstable. And so Fawn means you've learned a way of coping with your anxiety where you're just going to kind of keep the peace at all times. And so I'm never going to stir the pot. I'm never going to say anything controversial. I'm never going to say a hard thing in my marriage or to my roommate, and hope it all goes well. It's a sort of failed strategy of someone who's just trying to keep the peace instead of, I talk about the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking. Peacemakers are ambassadors of shalom. They have to speak into injustice. Peacekeepers are, oh gosh, what's going to happen if I do that? I'm going to get the angry email.
That's really good. Is there a relationship between those four tendencies to respond and some of the Enneagram numbers?
Yeah.
I'm hearing you, peacekeeper. I'm thinking 9.
Yeah, right. All three of those strategies we could break into particular types based on the work of a psychologist named Karen Horney, Horney, the Hornevian types. And you'd find those types represented, some that are more assertive, some that are more cooperative, some that are more disconnective, if you want to call it that. So yeah, it's all in the Enneagram, John. It's all answered in the secret knowledge of the Enneagram that has been with us for 2,000 years.
As you know, I'm well-versed. So well-versed, I can assign numbers to everyone.
Yeah. Well, you have the tattoo, which is important.
What's that?
You have the tattoo, which is important.
My friend Troy Nanninga, who was at Western when I was there a long, long time ago, offers this. You've talked about some ways to help move towards wholeheartedness on an individual level. Part of our work as pastors and leaders is to help bring this to the systems we lead and function in. What are some ways to help bring wholeheartedness to systems in which people are very anxious currently?
Yes. That's so good. And that's a really subjective question. So I was a pastor in Orlando, a pastor in San Francisco, and in both places I had to do diagnostic work. And then I worked with a couple church plants in between. And that's a whole different animal. But I remember when I arrived in San Francisco, there was a kind of diagnostic work around the collective, right? Around the city that I was in, around the community that I found myself in. And as I started doing that work, I realized, and this is just an example, obviously, this is not meant to answer all the questions, but this is how you sort of begin to think about wholeheartedness more collectively. What I realized was that the pastors were the experts for doing all the work out there. And there wasn't really an empowered laity. It tended to be a bit programmatic. There were classes, but it was primarily cognitive. And one of my senses was that there needed to be a real reshaping of our life together that was primarily around our worshiping life, the yearly, weekly, daily rhythms, liturgical rhythms of being restoried. So that became a sort of 5-year project for me. And then shutting some things down and actually building some other things. I remember early on, we started working with the diaconate to expand their understanding of their involvement in the life of the church. And that led to a much more robust understanding of how they come alongside people for wholeness, not just for, I can't pay my rent. So, I'm the deacon for 2 years, so I pay rent checks, But no, I'm actually contributing to the wholeheartedness of a community that requires a real intentional move toward justice in these ways here in this part of San Francisco. So wholeheartedness becomes a conversation that is localized and contextualized wherever you are.
So good and so important.
Yeah.
Scott Van Ravensway, for whom my dad will be forever grateful, asks, what are your pastoral understandings of waiting on the Lord? How does that look different than the flight or freeze responses?
Didn't I answer this question when you were in seminary, Scott?
Probably.
Well, I mean, when I think about waiting on the Lord, I see that as every sensory aspect of my being, every part of me is awake and alive. Waiting is active. Waiting is not passive, So waiting on the Lord doesn't look like hitting snooze and taking, 15 more minutes of sleep in the morning, where I just sort of rested comfortably in my bed. Waiting on the Lord is going to get up, get my cup of coffee. I'm going to find my spot. I'm going to sit and I'm going to dwell. And it's not actually bypassing by, reading the book, because that's easier than actually sort of sitting in the presence of God. It's nothing against reading books or reading scripture or any of that stuff, but it's actually sort of an active way of coming into the presence that is already there. And like, the thing is, we don't have a God who's like a genie where you have to sort of say a spell or something, rub the bottle or something. And then, like, God is like, I'm here. Yeah. I've been waiting. And so it's up to us to show up. And so active showing up to the God who's already present, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In wholeheartedness, I'm paraphrasing, so correct me, but you sort of talk about it's not just a beating back of some sinful self, but rather a coming alive to who you are in Christ. Maybe that's waiting on the Lord, coming alive to who you are.
I mean, imagine the thought of God as the magic genie who we have to conjure up that sort of waits on, like, this is what I need you to do today, versus a God who's already alive and active, and we simply awaken to our participation in a life that's already like, I'm looking out my window right now and I'm imagining the energy of the Spirit at work and alive and pulsating, and I just get to awaken to that rather than, I said the spell and I rubbed the thing 3 times, whatever the thing, I forget how it goes, but in a lap or something.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's good. It's one of the instincts of the missional congregation, I think, is to pay attention to the work of the Spirit in the world and go there rather than imagine yourself bringing the work of the Spirit somewhere.
That's exactly it.
Stephen Schaefer, up north a ways from us, in pursuing wholeheartedness what's that?
This is like the greatest hits of Western right now, as you say these names.
Awesome. Yeah. They're great people, great pastors.
Great people.
In pursuing wholeheartedness when everything in our lives and churches seems to be online, how do you stay engaged with the world without feeding our desire to compare ourselves with other pastors, other ministries, etc.? I don't think he's talking about, well, I'm teasing. We're all looking at how many views we got and how many views the next person had. And
so how do we not, like this, it's already happening. We live in, we sort of swim in the waters of comparison and competition. Yeah. It's sort of like the question that I got from someone on another webinar, like, how did you deal with yourself so well that like you wrote a book on narcissism? Obviously you're not a narcissist.
Right.
And it was like, well, no, when you write books and you tweet as much as I do and you stand up and you say, this is the word of the Lord, there's a little bit of that stuff in you, right? There's always going to be a sense of measuring oneself, whether it's the church down the block or now how many views did I get this week and how many people are now watching us from other places in the world. And so I think here again, we have to really pay attention to what that's doing to us and how that's working itself out in us. And oftentimes what I'll find is that people are not quite aware of it right away, but it sort of settles in as maybe a little bit of depression over a couple of days. Like I'm not sure why I feel as sad as I do. I'm thinking of a particular conversation recently with a pastor. Like there's just kind of a lethargy. I'm not sure what it is. I want it to go away. Is there something I can do? Is there a pill I can take? Is there a book I can read?
Yeah.
And when he paid attention, he realized that the lethargy felt, I said, where do you feel it in your body? He says, well, it actually feels like it's pressing on me. I said, what's pressing on you? And he said, the weight of measuring up, of being enough, and then as we teased that out, it was so many of my peers and my friends from seminary like have this technology and they've got people on their team, and I'm trying to do it with an iPhone and a duct tape, and I just don't know.
Yeah.
So pay attention.
Yeah. Jen, there's no last name here, so I'm unfortunately not. I can't locate her for you, but if connection is imperative to healthy mental health, how do we help those in quarantine/isolation find connectivity, and can that happen over the internet?
Yeah, well, connection can happen in all kinds of different ways. Feeling the feeling of feeling seen, which I know sounds like a weird phrase, but people cultivated believe it or not, John, you and I are probably old enough to remember, at least I remember in college, Sarah and I wrote letters to one another, and so there's nothing like back in the day to get a letter in my box at college and to open it up and to, literally to feel the rush of dopamine, oxytocin, and all the chemicals, right? Yeah. And to feel seen, to feel known, to feel connected with on that level. Obviously, what we long for is the kind of the connection that we're made for, that we know in the first minutes of our lives when we bond with our mothers, to be seen, to be soothed, to bond, to connect. But absent that, I think that there are real ways of connecting now, and I don't like the dichotomy of like, we're living during COVID, so we can't connect. We've got to find new and more creative ways of connecting with one another. I know plenty of people, because I see them, I counsel them, who were profoundly disconnected in the freest country on earth, you might say, when there is massive amount of opportunity to connect, people were massively disconnected before COVID. And so it requires some intentionality, and wherever you can find a space to be known. And I think that can happen. It happened recently with a few friends who, there are these providential new connections that are happening. I've gotten together now with my college roommates, but this happened with some older friends in ministry a few weeks ago, where I was able to sort of speak into the Zoom machine of some anxiety and some old habits that were creeping up that I wasn't happy about, to name those out loud and to feel seen, and to experience their curiosity. And it all happened like this.
Yeah. When we started the whole quarantine thing, I was quite pleased and surprised at how effective Zoom actually was. Yeah. I have to say, over time, it seems to be less so, just so taxing. You recommended to me a couple months ago, was it Kurt Thompson? And an article he wrote where he offered some like really simple healthcare practices in a Zoom world. Like
Yeah, we can maybe connect that link because I think we're probably going to send out this video to people who register, and we can connect that essay, that little article that he wrote. But he talked about how taxing Zoom is to us, because we're primarily during Zoom disembodied. We're living right, and so and how over time it might feel for some introverts, actually they're like, oh yeah, I like this, I get to be in a blanket, I'll wrap it around me. But over time there is a tax because we're not embodied with one another. So one of the things really early on, I filmed a short video, it's probably on Facebook somewhere, where I talked about getting out, taking walks, taking a walk once, twice, 3 times a day. Just get out, move your body. If possible, socially distance walk with someone. It's better than nothing, but get out, breathe the air. Now, I was saying that back in March when it was still snowing around here, but anything that you can do to sort of engage your body and to get with others in the process. Yeah.
That's great. There's a question from Bridget Kemmink. Can you talk a little more about how we are still living in the trauma? I work in a hospital as a chaplain. Our staff is present to trauma. We aren't in a place to make meaning out of it yet, and we want to. Can you talk about how we need to be patient with ourselves and others?
Yeah. So what she's talking about is often what I mean. Their whole vocation's given, occupation's given to just mitigating trauma. Yeah. It's like all you can do is in the midst of the triage, you're trying to put out the fire. And get people back down to sort of a level baseline, right? So the first thing, I know Bridget, and I know she does this, she's got to pay attention to herself and take care of herself, because we know from this is probably 10, 15 years in the making around the neuropsychology, trauma conversation. If we're not online and connected, living out of our PFC, our prefrontal cortex, in other words, alive, alert, present, connected, vulnerable, we will actually activate in trauma in other people. And so this is why, by the way, MLK, before sit-ins, would gather the crew together and actually walk through it. Do a walk. Let's be here in our bodies. Let's lay down. Let's imagine police officers coming in, binding us. How does that feel in your body? What does it look like? And so then we can show up in a way where it's like, okay, so I've already, I think Phil Jackson used to do this with the Bulls too. Let's mindfully walk through what this is going to feel like and look like, so that we can show up in a way that you sort of have to know your lane then. I'm in a place right now where I've got a friend who's a nurse on Long Island where I grew up, and she's like, it's all chaos right now. It's been chaos for the last 2 months. And all I'm doing is putting out fires. All I'm doing is mitigating damage. And then I leave, I breathe for a few hours, and I come back and I put out fires. So know that that's the case, but also know that there are different levels of care. And for some, that's going to mean that part of your work is actually inviting them to do the deeper work of engagement later or after that's over.
Thank you. There's a question from Pat. I don't know this for sure, but I'm wondering if it's my friend Pat Weatherwax. She and I went to seminary together like 20 years ago. Any advice for helping non-computer savvy, isolated senior citizens be seen when they are so isolated?
Yes. So one of the first calls I got was the day my narcissism book was being released. I was anxious. I was a mess, frankly. It was really early on in COVID. My dad calls and says, Chuck, you come. Stay-at-home orders now in place. I probably told you about this, John. Yeah, he's crying on the phone. Can you come? So that was excruciating. He lives down in Orlando. I live here. Dad, I can't come right now. I'm here. I'm with you. I'm with you right now. I will be with you later when I call. I can't come. I can't be there in body. Then who can come? Who is the army that we employ not employed like financially, but we employ to check in, to show up, right? And so my sister and I begin thinking about, like, what does that look like for dad who's mostly alone, taking care of my stepmom who's not well. This looks different. Again, like other questions, every situation is different. But but we start asking people, can you show up in these particular kinds of ways? You know, even the landscaper, can you just check in and say, hey, like from a distance, can you just say, Dick, I'm looking out for you. Love you, man.
That's good.
Yeah, it feels a little trivial because it's, you know, it's like, it's no replacement for the sun and being right there with you, but it's sort of like someone once said it takes a village. That might be too political and controversial for this moment, but it really does take that, I think, at times, especially for seniors who, like in a season like this, can't come out, can't socially distance walk, can't, whatever it might be, right?
There's if you don't mind, we're getting close on an hour. I want to read just a section of the book. And I'd love for you to respond to it.
Yep.
I've come to believe that there is, in fact, a spirit that dwells within us. God takes up residence. The inner light conquers our darkness and cannot be extinguished. And recognition of this inner light is the first sacramental step on the road to wholeness and wholeheartedness.
Yeah. So this idea of an inner light might actually sound a little esoteric to some. You know, it's actually a way in the tradition of talking about the light of Christ within. Sometimes it's living water, whatever the metaphor is that works for you. I grew up Lutheran, and there was the eternal light in the sanctuary of a Peace Lutheran Church. That for me was like, Mom, Dad, that light never goes off, you know? There are seasons when my attention to the light has waxed and waned, though, you know, and I think that there have been more compelling lights, frankly, in my life. And yet I find myself, and I know you do, and this is part of what we connect over, continually returning and longing to return to the light that is Christ, which, you know, allows me then to hold the other things, whether it be like really good things. I mean, for a while it was my marriage. I fell in love with Sarah, but it was like, you will solve all of my psychological, social, emotional needs. You will fix me, right? And then about 3 or 4 years in, she said, I'm not here to fix you. And I don't quite like where our marriage is going. And so we continually return to the light that is Christ, who dwells within, loves us, who redeems us, calls us beloved, who says, I'm always with you. Everything I have is yours. I think that over time can change us from the inside out. We can sort of rest in confidence that God is near.
So good. Thank you, my friend.
Yeah.
It's good to be with you.
Andy's back.
Whoa.
Well, first of all, just want to say thank you so much, Chuck. Thank you so much, Jon, for letting us all listen in and interact to this conversation that you've had today. There was a lot, and I thank you again for being willing to share that with us. As I mentioned before, we will follow up with an email with a link to this recording, which you can use again. We'll also throw some of those resources that were mentioned throughout this conversation on an email so that you can get that. A quick reminder, you'll get an email from us about the conversation next Wednesday, Race and the Church, a Christian response to the death of George Floyd. That's going to be next Wednesday, June 10, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we hope you can join us for that. Feel free to send that link around as well to anyone who you think might benefit from that conversation. So thank you to all of you who were able to be here with us today. Really appreciate you and your presence with us. And now, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, go in peace.